Hey everybody, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. And I want to tell a quick story here about a thing that happened a few years back. And if you are in the know on this story, because I know some people I share history with, listen to this thing, and you connect the dots that I'm talking about your situation, I hope I haven't brought something up that hurts or that causes you to revisit old wounds. I'm going to be vague anyway, so you can insert details in your own brains here as you want to. One time several years back, I was at work, and somebody I really liked came up to me and was like, "Hey, craziest thing." I was like, "Well, what's the craziest thing?" They were like, "I'm about to die." I didn't really know what to do with that because, well, you don't seem like it. Like, just standing here talking with me. But I listened to this person a little bit longer, and they explained, this is what's going to happen. This is where things are at. And it was brutal. One of the most memorable conversations I've ever had. In that moment, I had a whole bunch of different emotions that flashed. One of them was empathy and sympathy and my own grief and sympathy toward the grief of the people who I knew this thing was going to affect. And some big, grand, philosophical, existential questions about how the universe works and where God fits into all of that, and all the stuff that you'd imagine somebody would think about in that moment. But there was also this thing that flashed in me that was like, there's got to be some options here. We can fight this thing. Let's figure out what we could do. I mean, there's always a recourse. We just haven't thought about it hard enough yet. We'll think about it hard enough and we'll take action and we'll do something. And as this person explained a little bit more about what was going on, that eagerness for me to jump into the fray and solve it got quenched, I suppose, by the reality of the situation. And as this person told me would happen, so it came to pass that he did. He passed away. Yeah, I don't know. You're smart. You're emotionally savvy. It's just a brutal thing and tough on a ton of people. And there's a whole lot to think about there. Anytime we experience loss, whether it's in very close proximity to us, as I know many of you have experienced, and as you may know that I have as well, or whether it's in close-ish proximity. And it's like there are different things that we process depending on the proximity. But I mean, mortality, that's the big one that hangs out there, right? That's the thing that puts a clock on human affairs and all of our urgency. It's that buffer bar that we all know is running all the time. We have in our brain our own conception of about how long life ought to be, and then we can do simple division to figure out where we're at, and so therefore how far along the buffer bar is. And it can be a source of great anxiety. It can be a source of great motivation. But when something doesn't add up in terms of that buffer bar and the timeline, it really does mess with us. And one of the natural human responses, once again, is this impulse to bargain, this impulse to combat it, to fight it, to make that lifetime buffer bar make sense and square with our expectations. And so in Matthew chapter 16, what we are getting here is another very empathetic moment from our point of view characters, that being the disciples, and that point of view character of point of view characters who we most hear from and can most relate to, and that is Peter. Because in Matthew 16, we get Peter's confession of Christ. You're the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. And Jesus is like, you nailed it. That's exactly who I am, and that's from God, so blessed are you. And so some people read that, and they're like, so, Peter was pretty special. And I think everybody would agree that Peter's pretty special, pretty unique in the role that he plays here. But any illusion that Peter has his head perfectly screwed on straight and somehow enters into this new state of infallibility after this exchange with Jesus, which I don't think anybody actually believes happened here, such misconception is immediately disabused in the very next passage when Peter acts like a person, like you or like me, in the face of a prediction of death or a promise of death that doesn't seem just or right and that doesn't fit our notions of the buffer bar and how long people are supposed to have in this world, because Jesus follows up all of that stuff about I'm the Christ, the Messiah, which it makes it clear like the kingdom is happening and God is making this thing go. He follows all of that up with apparently repeated instructions to his disciples over a given period of time saying that he's going to go to Jerusalem and he's going to die, and that weirdly he's going to be raised to life. So Matthew 16:21 that we talked about yesterday goes like this. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. This is where we get the human reaction. The disciples get some news that doesn't compute, doesn't seem right to a young person, and they respond with the brashness that a young person like myself, when I got that news back in the day, might respond. I mean, they're ready to fight, ready to say, no, that isn't how things are going to go. So then it says in verse 22, Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him. Never, Lord, he said, this shall never happen to you. There's enough fodder here to fill much more than the remaining few minutes that we have in this conversation. But first of all, Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him. Do you remember a minute ago? Because I can't remember whether we talked about it or not, or if it's come up at all in like the last 2 weeks. But it seems like a minute ago, Peter was like, I know who you are. You are the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. Now you would think that along with those professions of who Jesus is would come the assumption that Jesus knows a thing or two. Because like if he's the Son of God, even if you don't know exactly what that fully entails yet, you'd think he might have chatted with God at some point or have some idea about some things that God would know that normal people wouldn't know, and they'd be maybe real super smart or kind of in control of things. And you might think back to a time when Jesus controlled the wind and the waves twice, or even gave you, Peter, the ability to momentarily just straight up walk on water on a choppy sea, like just walk on it, like on the floor. They had a Kmart. You were doing that for a second. Do you remember? But Peter, in his humanity and in his, I think, genuine love and passion for Jesus and concern for his well-being and concern for the well-being of where all this is going, and maybe also concern for the well-being of himself, knowing that they are in a difficult spot without their leader, their rabbi with them, he goes and chews out Jesus, who he has seen outmaneuver the most brilliant minds with the best education and training right and left throughout the course of everything we've seen so far in Matthew. Peter's like, yeah, well, I got this one. And so he pulls Jesus aside and he's like, no, you're wrong. Like you're wrong about this. And that is not going to happen. Now, when Peter says, never, Lord, this shall never happen to you, is he saying it like, Jesus, you're wrong. Your information has been good that you've operated off of up until this point. But on this one, I've got some inside information. I've got to read on things too. And you're reading the situation wrong. It's actually going to go different than you said. Maybe he's saying that. Or is Peter doing the tough guy, my role in this social circle is I'm likes to fight guy, and I show love to people I care about by being like, anybody tries to touch you, I'll freaking kill them. I will. I totally will. And everybody's like, okay, gross. That's a little much. Thank you, Pete. But dial that back maybe a touch. I think it's the latter. I could be totally wrong. Who knows? We're speculating about a conversation that could be reasonably read a few different ways here. But to me, it feels consistent with the character of Peter, that he isn't asserting that Jesus is wrong and lacks knowledge, but that he is asserting his own, that is Peter's own strength to be like, no, I can handle this situation. And through the force of my will and the power of my muscular right arm, I will fend off any danger that might approach you. And maybe in some misguided way, Peter felt like this is how he shows Jesus that he loves him and that he's in and really committed and that he knows what role he's supposed to play. But if you look at the larger Bible, you start to get the impression that the number of people that Christians are supposed to kill in the name of Jesus in order to make Christianity happen by force is 0, and that's rounding up. It looks like violence to make the kingdom happen is advocated for nowhere and denounced almost everywhere that the subject comes up. So Peter is getting two things wrong here. Thing number one that he's getting wrong is that he is supposing to imagine himself to be of such wisdom, perspective, and strength that he can tell someone he just rightly identified as the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God, that he can tell that kind of a person how the things actually are going to be and what can be achieved by the mighty hand of Peter. And the second place that he's getting it wrong is that he simply isn't getting what the game plan is yet. And I feel empathy for Peter in this, and I think you should too, because I don't think that if you and I were a part of this train all the way up through chapter 16, that we would get it yet either. We have the benefit of all the rest of the Bible in a couple thousand years, and we might roll our eyes at theology and be like, oh, it's dumb and overwrought. But I don't know, a lot of smart men and women put a lot of thought into making sense out of all of these things, and we benefit from their work and perspective over the centuries. It was all raw and new, and it was so much to take in and not that much time to process. And so Peter has missed a few of the very obvious hints that have come along the way as to what Jesus' role is going to be. Hints that are evident when you look back on it now, with 2020 vision. Hints that are really evident from everything that you and I would call the Old Testament. Hints that are really evident from things that Jesus already said, but that maybe the whole game plan of Jesus' role in redemption and what he's there to do, I think it's totally defensible that just wouldn't have made sense to the disciples at this point, especially when you mix in the human element of denial, the human capacity for denial, the human capacity to say, oh, there's an impending tragedy. Well, through my strength and control of the external world, I am going to thwart that apparently predetermined outcome and make things more the way I want them to be. The same way I felt that impulse when I got that news that day from somebody I really cared about. So all the more Peter feels that impulse here. Peter, like us, is flawed. Peter, like us, through God's work in his life, has the capacity to be a part of very redemptive things and do really cool things. And Peter, like us, when stewing in the brine of his fallen humanity and obsession with self, he gets things wrong. Yeah, okay, well, all of that sounds familiar. All that seems like is how it plays out for humans in general. So here, he does a thing that probably you or I would have done as well. It would have been like, what? I love you. No, I'll fight. How do you want me to fight? I'm going to fight. That is never going to happen. And we'll look at Jesus' response, which is firmly negative, next time around. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.